The hand that touched hers was warm. She hadn't expected that. Through the haze of fever and exhaustion, through the fog of fear that had wrapped around her heart since the moment of capture, that warmth cut through everything. His fingers, steady and gentle, pressed against the inside of her wrist, counting her pulse. She flinched, waiting for the grip to tighten, for the violence she had been promised would come. But it never did. Instead, the American Army surgeon looked up from his watch, met her eyes, and said something in English she couldn't understand. His voice was soft, almost kind. That terrified her more than shouting ever could. Her name was Margaret Hoffman, though everyone called her Greta. 26 years old, trained at Vienna's prestigious Allgemeines Krankenhaus, she had spent 3 years as a Red Cross nurse attached to German Wehrmacht units. She had seen men die in her arms in the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. She had stitched wounds in field hospitals while artillery shells screamed overhead. She had learned to work with hands that never stopped shaking, to sleep in 15-minute intervals, to eat whatever food could be scrounged. She thought she had learned everything war could teach about suffering. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, lying on a cot in an American prisoner of war camp hospital, watching an enemy doctor examine her with the careful attention one might give to a sister or daughter. The propaganda had been relentless. From the moment the Anschluss brought Austria into the Reich in 1938, the messages had poured forth like water from a broken dam. America, they were told, was a land of gangsters and savages, a nation of mongrels who had abandoned civilization for money and machines. Their soldiers, the posters warned, were brutal beyond measure. Women captured by Americans would face unspeakable horrors. Some whispered that female prisoners were sent to labor camps in the desert, worked to death under the merciless sun. Others spoke of worse fates, things too terrible to name aloud, but hinted at in the fearful glances exchanged between nurses when the subject arose. Greta had believed it all. Why wouldn't she? She had grown up in Salzburg, in the shadow of the Hohensalzburg fortress, in a world where order and tradition meant everything. Her father had been a doctor, her mother a pianist. They had raised her to value discipline, excellence, and duty. When the Reich came, promising to restore Austria's greatness, to make them part of something larger and more glorious, it had seemed natural, inevitable. She had volunteered for the Red Cross at 23, driven by a genuine desire to heal, to serve, to make meaning from the chaos that was consuming Europe. By 1943, she was stationed in Italy, attached to a field hospital near Salerno. The Allies had landed in September, and the world had turned to fire and thunder. For weeks, the hospital had moved, constantly, retreating north as American and British forces pushed inland. They had treated hundreds of wounded, working day and night in conditions that grew more desperate with each passing hour. Supplies dwindled, morphine ran out. They operated by candlelight when the generators failed, holding flashlights in their teeth while their hands worked to save lives that often couldn't be saved. The morning of her capture arrived without warning. She had been in a makeshift hospital in a commandeered villa, tending to a young soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel when the shelling began. Not from a distance this time, but close. So close, the building shook and plaster dust rained from the ceiling. Then came the shouting in a language she didn't recognize at first. English, American voices, sharp and commanding. German soldiers stumbled past, some wounded, others simply fleeing. An officer grabbed her arm and shouted that they were evacuating. But before she could gather her supplies, the villa's main entrance exploded inward. American soldiers poured through, rifles raised, faces blackened with soot and dirt. Greta froze. This was the moment she had been warned about. This was where the nightmare would begin. She waited for the violence, for the brutality that propaganda had promised. But the sergeant who approached her lowered his rifle when he saw her Red Cross armband. He spoke words she couldn't understand, but his tone wasn't cruel. It was almost apologetic. Another soldier, younger, with frightened eyes that reminded her of the boys she had treated, gestured for her to move toward the door. She walked on legs that barely held her weight, past the wounded German soldiers who stared at her with hollow eyes, past the wreckage of the hospital she had tried so hard to maintain. They loaded her and 15 other medical personnel onto a truck. The ride was rough, bouncing over roads cratered by bombs and tank treads. Nobody spoke. The Americans guarding them said nothing. Greta pressed herself into the corner of the truck bed, her mind racing through every terrible story she had heard. They would be shot, she was certain, or sent to some remote camp where they would be worked to death, or worse. Always worse in the stories. The female nurses huddled together, some crying softly, others staring straight ahead with expressions of such bleak resignation that it broke Greta's heart more than her own fear did. The truck arrived at a large encampment as the sun was setting. Rows and rows of tents stretched across a field surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But something was wrong with the picture. The prisoners walking between the tents weren't skeletal. They weren't being beaten or chased by dogs. They looked thin, yes, and weary, but they were walking upright, talking to each other. One group was even playing cards outside a tent, seemingly unsupervised except for a single guard who leaned against a post, smoking. Greta and the other nurses were separated from the male prisoners and led to a different section of the camp. An American officer, a woman, met them at the processing tent. She wore the insignia of the Army Nurse Corps and spoke in careful, broken German. She explained that they would be registered, that their names would be reported to the International Red Cross, that they would be given medical examinations and assigned quarters. Her tone was businesslike, but not unkind. When one of the younger Austrian nurses began to weep uncontrollably, the American nurse placed a hand on her shoulder and waited patiently until the sobbing subsided. The medical examination. That was where Greta's world tilted on its axis. She was led to a tent that had been converted into a clinic. Inside, the cleanliness shocked her. White sheets on examination tables, glass cabinets filled with supplies, electric lights powered by a generator that hummed steadily outside. After months of working in darkness and filth, the sight was almost obscene in its abundance. An American medic, a woman with red hair and tired eyes, gestured for Greta to sit. She took Greta's temperature, checked her eyes and throat, listened to her lungs with a stethoscope that looked newer than any equipment Greta had seen in 2 years. Then he walked in. The surgeon. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples. His uniform was clean but worn, his hands scrubbed pink. He nodded to the medic, said something in English, then turned to Greta. He looked at her not with hatred or lust or contempt, but with the professional assessment of one medical practitioner evaluating a patient. He spoke a few words in terrible, halting German, something about checking her health, making sure she was not injured. Then he reached for her wrist. That touch, that warm, gentle touch, his fingers finding her pulse point, his eyes on his watch, counting. 30 seconds. A full minute. He frowned slightly, not in anger but in concentration. He said something to the medic who wrote notes on a clipboard. Then he examined Greta's hands, turning them over, looking at the calluses and scars that came from years of medical work. He paused at a burn mark on her left palm, an old injury from a surgery lamp that had overheated. His thumb traced the edge of the scar lightly, and he looked up at her with what she could only describe as recognition. He understood. This was the hand of someone who healed. He asked her something in English. The medic translated in broken German. He wanted to know if she was a nurse. Greta nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He asked where she had trained. She whispered, Vienna. Allgemeines Krankenhaus. His eyebrows rose. He said something that sounded impressed, and the medic translated. He had studied medical journals from that hospital. He knew of its reputation. For a moment, enemy lines dissolved. They were simply two medical professionals, acknowledging each other's training and dedication. He completed the examination with the same gentle thoroughness, checked her reflexes, her lymph nodes, looked in her ears. He discovered that she was malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from the early stages of trench fever, a louse-borne illness that had plagued both sides of every front. He spoke to the medic who wrote more notes. Then he did something that made Greta's eyes fill with tears. He smiled at her. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, but a reassuring one. The kind of smile a doctor gives a patient to say, "You're going to be all right." The medic explained in halting German that Greta would be kept in the hospital tent for treatment. that she would receive medicine, food, and rest, that once she recovered, she would be assigned to work in the camp hospital if she wished, or to other duties if she preferred. The choice, incredibly, was hers. The American surgeon said one more thing before leaving, and though Greta didn't understand the words, she understood the tone. He was telling her not to be afraid. That night, lying on a cot with clean sheets, a blanket that smelled of soap, and a belly fuller than it had been in months, Greta stared at the canvas ceiling of the hospital tent and tried to make sense of what had happened. Everything she had been told was a lie. The Americans weren't monsters. This camp wasn't a death sentence. The doctor who had examined her had shown more compassion in 10 minutes than some of her own officers had shown in months. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the enemy be kind? How could the people she had been taught to fear and hate be the ones offering her food, medicine, and safety? Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of the camp at night, guards walking their rounds, other prisoners coughing or talking softly. Once she heard laughter from somewhere in the distance, laughter in a prison camp. It seemed impossible. When dawn broke, flooding the tent with pale light, Greta realized that everything she thought she knew about this war, about the enemy, about America, had shattered like glass. And in the wreckage of those beliefs, something new and terrifying was beginning to emerge, the possibility that she had been fighting for the wrong side all along. The American surgeon returned that morning during rounds. He checked her temperature, examined the IV drip that had been started to combat her dehydration, and made notes on a chart at the foot of her bed. He spoke to her in his broken German, asking how she felt. She answered in her limited English, learned from medical textbooks, that she felt better. His face lit up with surprised approval. He switched to English, speaking slowly, and she understood perhaps one word in 3. But the meaning was clear. He was pleased she was improving. He wanted her to rest, to eat, to regain her strength, and then, if she was willing, she could help in the hospital. They needed skilled nurses. The war had not stopped producing wounded men, even here behind the lines. As he turned to leave, Greta found her voice. "Thank you," she said in English, the words feeling strange in her mouth. He paused, looked back, and smiled that same reassuring smile. "You're welcome," he replied. And in that moment, in that simple exchange of gratitude and acknowledgement, the first thread of connection was woven. Neither of them knew it yet, but that thread would grow stronger with each passing day, binding together two people who had every reason to remain enemies and no reason at all to become anything more, except for the one reason that transcends all others, the shared calling to heal and the stubborn resilience of the human heart, even in war's darkest hours. Within 3 days, Greta was back on her feet, though still weak. The trench fever had been caught early enough that the treatment, rest, proper nutrition, and cleanliness worked quickly. On the morning of the 4th day, the surgeon whose name she had learned was Captain James Bennett asked through a translator if she felt strong enough to work. Not as a prisoner performing labor, he clarified, but as a nurse, a colleague. The distinction seemed important to him. Greta agreed immediately. Lying idle while others suffered went against everything her training had instilled in her. The camp hospital was unlike anything she had experienced. It occupied 6 large tents connected by covered walkways, with wooden floors that kept the mud at bay and screened walls that let in air while keeping out insects. One tent served as triage and intake. Another housed the surgical theater. The remaining tents were recovery wards separated by severity of injury. The organizational efficiency reminded her of Vienna's teaching hospitals, but the abundance of supplies was what truly staggered her. Cabinets lined with bandages, shelves stocked with medications, sterilization equipment that actually worked. There were even blood storage units, kept cool by a system she didn't fully understand, ready for transfusions. Captain Bennett introduced her to the medical staff with a formality that bordered on ceremonious. There were 4 American nurses, 2 medics, another surgeon who was older and perpetually exhausted, and now Greta. He explained in his careful, broken German that she would work primarily in the recovery wards, administering medications, changing dressings, and monitoring patients. If she demonstrated competence, and he said this while looking directly at her with those serious dark eyes, she would be invited to assist in surgery. For a prisoner of war to be offered the chance to work in an operating theater was extraordinary. It spoke to a desperate need for skilled hands, yes, but also to something else. Trust, perhaps, or at least the willingness to see skill beyond nationality. The language barrier should have been insurmountable. English and German share some roots, but medical conversation requires precision. Lives depend on clear communication. Yet Greta discovered within hours that she and Captain Bennett shared a language more universal than either English or German. Latin. Every bone, every muscle, every procedure had a Latin name. When he asked for a scalpel during her first observation in surgery, he said, "Scalpelum," and she understood. When she warned him about potential hematoma, the word was nearly identical in both their vocabularies: sutura, fractura, contusio. The ancient language of medicine became their bridge. Her first week working in the hospital revealed the vast gulf between American and German medical capabilities. In Germany and Austria, by 1943, supplies had become critically scarce. She had learned to reuse bandages after boiling them, to stretch morphine doses until they barely dulled pain, to perform surgeries without proper anesthesia when there was no choice. She had seen men die from infections that should have been preventable, watched gangrene claim limbs that might have been saved with better resources. Here, in this prisoner of war camp in North Africa, the Americans had more medical supplies than some German field hospitals she had worked in during the first year of the war. The abundance troubled her deeply at first. How could the enemy have so much when her own side had so little? It seemed wasteful, almost obscene. But as she worked day after day, she began to understand. It wasn't waste. It was logistics. The Americans had built a supply chain that could move equipment and medicines from factories across an ocean to field hospitals in active war zones. They had the industrial capacity to produce these supplies in quantities that seemed impossible to her. And more than that, they had the will to use those supplies not just on their own wounded, but on prisoners as well. The Geneva Convention required minimal care for POWs. What the Americans provided went far beyond minimal. Captain Bennett seemed to recognize her confusion. One evening, after a particularly difficult surgery on a German prisoner who had developed peritonitis, he found her in the supply tent, staring at rows of penicillin vials. The new wonder drug, discovered by a British scientist but mass-produced by American pharmaceutical companies, had only recently become available even to Allied forces. Yet, here it sat, being used to save the life of an enemy soldier. Bennett approached quietly and stood beside her. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the vials alongside her. Then, in his halting German supplemented with gestures and simple words, he tried to explain. America believed that healing was not political, that medicine served humanity, not flags, that treating prisoners well was not weakness, but civilization. She turned to him, and for the first time, she challenged him. Her English was improving rapidly through immersion, and she forced out the words, "Why, we are enemies. We killed your soldiers." Her grammar was broken, but her meaning clear. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "You are a nurse," he said finally, speaking slowly so she could understand. "You heal. That is not my enemy. That is my colleague." The simplicity of his logic was devastating. He had separated the person from the nation, the individual from the ideology. It was a distinction she had never been taught to make. Their working relationship deepened through shared exhaustion and shared purpose. Trauma does not pause for language barriers or national allegiances. When 3 American soldiers arrived with severe burns from a tank fire, Greta worked alongside Bennett for 16 hours straight, applying the new treatments for burns that American military medicine had pioneered. When a young German prisoner came in with a perforated bowel, she assisted in the surgery, anticipating Bennett's needs with the intuition that comes only from extensive experience. He noticed. After that surgery, as they scrubbed their hands in adjacent basins, he looked at her with undisguised respect and said in English, "You're an excellent nurse." She understood every word. The other American medical staff gradually accepted her as well. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the head nurse, was initially cold, which Greta understood. Morrison had lost a brother at Anzio. Her grief was fresh and raw, but medicine has a way of breaking down walls. When a patient crashed during Morrison's shift and Greta responded instantly, performing cardiac compressions with textbook precision while Morrison administered epinephrine, something shifted. Afterward, Morrison looked at her and said quietly, "Thank you." It was a beginning. Small rituals developed. Bennett drank coffee constantly, thick and black from a battered tin cup. He offered her some one morning, and though it tasted like burnt dirt to her Austrian palate accustomed to milder brews, she accepted. It became their morning routine. 2 cups of terrible coffee before rounds, standing outside the surgical tent, watching the sun rise over the camp. They didn't talk much during these moments. They didn't need to. The companionship of shared silence after shared night shifts said more than words could. He began to teach her, not consciously at first, but naturally. He showed her the new techniques for treating shock, the protocols for blood transfusions that were still being refined, the proper dosing for sulfa drugs. She absorbed everything with the hunger of someone who had been starved not of food, but of knowledge. Medical science had continued advancing while she was trapped in retreating field hospitals with dwindling supplies. Bennett recognized that hunger and fed it. He lent her American medical journals, which she read slowly, dictionary in hand, expanding both her medical knowledge and her English vocabulary simultaneously. She taught him as well, though he never asked directly. The Viennese medical tradition emphasized certain diagnostic techniques that American training sometimes rushed past. She showed him a palpation method for detecting internal bleeding that her professors had perfected. She shared herbal remedies that could supplement medications when supplies ran low, knowledge passed down through generations of Austrian physicians. He listened, tried her methods, and when they worked, thanked her with genuine appreciation. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, each bringing different strengths to their shared work. The emotional shift happened so gradually that neither could identify the exact moment it began. Perhaps it was the night they lost a patient together, a 19-year-old American private who died from complications they couldn't prevent. Bennett sat afterward on a crate outside the tent, his head in his hands, and Greta sat down beside him without speaking. She understood that particular grief, the weight of a life you couldn't save. After a long silence, he spoke in English, forgetting she might not understand every word. He talked about why he became a doctor, about his father who had been a country physician in Vermont, about his belief that every life mattered. She understood perhaps half the words, but all of the meaning. Or perhaps it was the morning he noticed the scar on her forearm, a jagged line from wrist to elbow. He asked about it with his eyes, and she explained in her improving English that it came from the Eastern Front, from flying shrapnel when a hospital was bombed. He touched the scar lightly, professionally, but something in his expression wasn't entirely professional. It was personal. It was the look of someone recognizing another person's pain and wishing they could have prevented it, or perhaps it was simply the accumulation of 100 small moments. The way he made sure she ate during long shifts, bringing her food when she was too focused on patients to remember hunger. The way she anticipated which instrument he would need during surgery before he asked. The way they developed their own hybrid language, part English, part German, part Latin, part gesture, entirely their own. The way he laughed, really laughed, when she made a joke in broken English about the terrible coffee. The way she felt her heart lift when she arrived for a shift and saw he was already there. 3 months into her assignment at the hospital, Bennett asked if she would assist him in a particularly complex surgery. A German officer had been brought in with severe abdominal injuries, multiple organ damage, the kind of case that would require hours of meticulous work. Bennett wanted the best nurse available. He wanted her. The surgery lasted 9 hours. They worked in perfect synchronization, a dance of scalpel and suture, of crisis and response. When it was over, when the patient was stable and being moved to recovery, they stood in the surgical tent, both swaying with exhaustion. Bennett pulled off his mask and looked at her. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said. "Not as a superior to a subordinate, not as an American to a prisoner, but as one healer to another." She pulled off her own mask, and for the first time she smiled at him. Not the polite professional smile of a nurse, but something genuine and warm. "We saved him," she said in English, the grammar perfect this time. "We did it together." He smiled back, and in that smile, she saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She saw affection, perhaps even more than affection, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her chest like a weight, that she felt the same way. The realization kept her awake that night. This was impossible. He was American, she was Austrian, he was her captor, technically, though he had never treated her as anything less than an equal. She was a prisoner, though she had more freedom and better treatment than most free people in Europe at that moment. They were on opposite sides of a war that had consumed the world. Every rule, every regulation, every social norm said this was forbidden. Fraternization between captor and captive was prohibited by military law. Even friendship pushed the boundaries. Anything beyond that was unthinkable. Yet as dawn broke and she rose for another shift, she knew it was already too late. The boundaries had already been crossed, not physically, but emotionally. Somewhere between the first gentle touch of his hand checking her pulse and the 9-hour surgery where they moved as one, she had begun to fall in love with James Bennett. And from the way he looked at her during morning coffee rounds, the way his face lit up when she walked into the surgical tent, the way he found excuses to work beside her even when it wasn't strictly necessary, she suspected he felt the same. They were walking toward something that could destroy them both, but neither of them seemed able to stop. The human heart, Greta had learned in her medical training, is simply a muscle. 4 chambers, valves, electrical impulses that keep rhythm. It pumps blood, nothing more. Yet standing in the hospital tent at dawn, watching James Bennett check the overnight charts with his reading glasses perched on his nose, she felt that simple muscle betray every rational thought she possessed. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. Prisoners weren't supposed to fall in love with their captors. Nurses weren't supposed to lose their professional distance. Austrian women weren't supposed to betray their homeland by caring for an American man. Yet here she stood, and here her heart beat faster, and no amount of medical knowledge could explain it away or make it stop. The military regulations were explicit and unforgiving. The United States Army prohibited fraternization between American personnel and prisoners of war under any circumstances. The penalties ranged from discharge to court-martial, depending on the severity of the relationship. For medical staff, the rules were even stricter. The power dynamic between doctor and patient, between captor and captive, made any personal relationship inherently suspect. Bennett knew these rules intimately. He had been briefed on them, had signed documents acknowledging them, and wore the responsibility of command that required him to enforce them. Yet Greta watched him struggle with that responsibility every day, saw it in the way he caught himself standing too close to her during rounds, heard it in the careful formality he tried to maintain in his voice, even as his eyes said something entirely different. For her part, the moral conflict cut even deeper. She was, by the laws of war, still a soldier of the Reich. Her oath, sworn when she joined the Red Cross Medical Service, had been to Germany and to the German people. Falling in love with an enemy officer wasn't just prohibited by his military code, by the standards she had been raised with, by the propaganda that still echoed in corners of her mind. It was treason. Worse than treason, it was a fundamental betrayal of everything she was supposed to be. She tried to remind herself of this during sleepless nights, tried to summon anger or patriotic fervor, or at least self-preservation. But all she could summon was the memory of his hands, careful and skilled, holding a patient's life between his fingers. All she could feel was the certainty that this man, this enemy, was one of the best people she had ever known. The other prisoners noticed first. In the women's barracks, where 24 female prisoners of war, mostly nurses and clerical workers, lived in crowded proximity. Privacy was impossible. They saw Greta return from hospital shifts with a distant expression. They heard her speak English in her sleep. One evening, an older Austrian nurse named Helena, who had worked in Berlin before the war, sat down beside Greta on her bunk and spoke quietly. "You're in love with him, the American surgeon." It wasn't a question. Greta opened her mouth to deny it, but Helena raised a hand. "I'm not judging. I've seen how he looks at you too. But child, you must be careful. This cannot end well." Helena's warning was gentle, born of concern rather than condemnation, but not everyone was so understanding. Another prisoner, a younger woman named Elsa, who had been engaged to a Luftwaffe pilot killed over Britain, confronted Greta more directly. "You smile at him," she hissed one night after lights out. "You laugh with the enemy while our men die. Have you forgotten who you are? What you are?" The words struck like a physical blow. Greta lay awake afterward, staring at the darkness, asking herself the same questions. Had she forgotten? Or had she simply learned that the enemy she'd been taught to hate was a lie? The American medical staff noticed as well, though their reactions were more complex. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison watched the growing connection with visible concern. One afternoon, she pulled Greta aside in the supply tent and spoke in careful, simple English, so Greta would understand every word. "Captain Bennett is a good man, best surgeon I've worked with. But what you two are doing, even if it's just looks and coffee, it puts him at risk. They could take his commission, send him home in disgrace. Do you understand?" Greta understood. The weight of that understanding sat on her chest like a stone. She was endangering him simply by existing, simply by feeling what she felt. Yet neither she nor Bennett seemed capable of stepping back. They tried briefly after Morrison's warning. For 3 days, they maintained rigid professional distance. He called her Nurse Hoffman instead of Greta. She addressed him only as Captain Bennett. They avoided being alone together, spoke only when necessary, and kept their conversations strictly medical. It was agony. Worse than agony, it felt fundamentally wrong, like trying to unlearn a language or forget how to breathe. On the third night, during an emergency surgery on a prisoner who had developed internal bleeding, they fell back into their natural rhythm without thinking, anticipating each other's movements, communicating with glances, working as the seamless unit they had become. Afterward, standing at the scrub basin, Bennett spoke without looking at her. "I can't pretend anymore, Greta. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But I can't." She looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of surgery, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and resignation. "I know," she whispered in English. "I also cannot." The admission hung between them like a confession. They had named the thing that had been growing in silence. There was no taking it back now. The arithmetic of their impossible situation consumed Greta's thoughts. She tried to calculate a way forward and found only dead ends. If Germany won the war, which seemed increasingly unlikely by late 1943, she would be liberated, and Bennett would likely become a prisoner himself. If the Allies won, she would be repatriated to a devastated Austria, probably never to see him again. There was no scenario in which they simply got to be together. The war had placed them in each other's path only to ensure they could never truly walk it together. The mathematics of impossibility, she thought bitterly. Add one Austrian nurse to one American surgeon, subtract a world war, and somehow arrive at heartbreak. Yet the heart, that stubborn muscle, refused to accept impossible mathematics. It kept finding ways to connect despite everything. Small moments became treasured rituals. Bennett started leaving medical journals on her workstation, articles circled that he thought would interest her. She began leaving him cups of coffee, prepared the way he liked it, on mornings when he had worked through the night. These tiny gestures, innocent, enough to avoid suspicion but laden with unspoken meaning, became their secret language. One night, during a rare quiet period when no new patients had arrived and the recovery wards were stable, Bennett found Greta sitting outside the surgical tent, looking up at the stars. The North African sky was spectacular, unpolluted by city lights, vast and ancient. He sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance, but present. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he began to talk in English about his home, about Vermont, a place she had never heard of, about mountains covered in trees that changed color in autumn, about winters so cold that lakes froze solid enough to walk on, about a small town where everyone knew everyone, and his father's medical practice had been in the same building for 40 years. She listened, understanding perhaps 60% of his words, but all of his meaning. He was showing her who he was beyond the uniform, beyond the war. When he finished, she told him about Salzburg, about the fortress that had stood for 900 years, about the sound of church bells echoing through narrow streets, about her father teaching her to read medical texts before she was 10 years old, about her mother's hands on piano keys, creating beauty in a world that was already beginning to darken with the coming storm. She told him about the last time she had seen her parents in 1941 before she was deployed to the Eastern Front. She didn't know if they were still alive. The letters had stopped coming months ago. Bennett reached out then, without thinking, and took her hand, just held it, his fingers intertwined with hers. It was the first deliberate, unmistakably intimate physical contact between them. She should have pulled away. Every rule said she should pull away. Instead, she held on tighter. They sat like that for perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps an hour. Time lost its meaning. Finally, he released her hand and stood. "This is dangerous," he said quietly. "For both of us." She stood as well, facing him. "I know," she replied. "But James, I think maybe it is too late to be safe." It was the first time she had used his given name. He closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain, then opened them and looked at her with such intensity that she felt it physically. "Greta, if they find out, if anyone reports this, I'll lose everything. My commission, my career, maybe even my freedom." She nodded. She knew. "And you," he continued, "you could be transferred to a different camp or face charges of collaboration. The other prisoners might turn on you completely." She knew that too. The risk was not theoretical. It was real and immediate and could destroy them both. "Then we must be very careful," she said finally. It wasn't a decision to stop. It was a decision to continue with full knowledge of the cost. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted from conflict to resolution. They would be careful. They would maintain every professional propriety in public. But in the stolen moments, in the quiet spaces between emergencies, they would allow themselves this connection that defied every rule and regulation. The next weeks became a study in contradiction. In the hospital, they were paragons of professional conduct. Captain Bennett and Nurse Hoffman, nothing more. But in the spaces between, during night shifts when they were alone in the surgical tent, during early morning coffee before the camp fully woke, in the few moments when they could speak without witnesses, they became simply James and Greta. Two people who had found each other in the least likely place imaginable and refused to let impossibility dictate their hearts. He brought her a gift once, something so simple it was almost absurd, a bar of chocolate from his personal rations. In a camp where she was adequately fed, it wasn't about the food, it was about the gesture, about him giving her something precious from his limited personal supplies. She held that chocolate for 2 days before eating it, savoring not the future taste, but the present meaning. In return, she gave him something she had carried since Vienna, a small medal of St. Luke, patron saint of physicians, that her father had given her when she finished her nursing training. "For keeping you safe," she said, pressing it into his palm. He wore it on a chain under his uniform, against his heart. The other American medics began to suspect, though no one spoke of it directly. They saw the way Bennett's entire demeanor changed when Greta entered a room. They noticed how he volunteered for shifts that coincided with hers. They observed the unspoken communication between them during surgeries, the way two people move when they're attuned to each other on a level beyond the professional. But they also saw that both maintained absolute propriety, never touching except when medically necessary, never being alone together in circumstances that could be considered compromising. The medical staff made a collective, silent decision to see nothing, to report nothing. Perhaps because they recognized genuine connection when they saw it. Perhaps because in the midst of war's cruelty, they couldn't bring themselves to destroy something beautiful, even if it was forbidden. The moral conflict never left Greta entirely. Late at night, she still wrestled with her conscience. She thought about her parents, about whether they would be ashamed of her. She thought about the soldiers she had treated, the men who had died believing they fought for something righteous. She thought about her homeland, now occupied and divided, suffering under the weight of a war it had helped to start. Loving James felt like abandoning all of that. But then morning would come, and she would see him across the hospital tent, focused on saving a life, any life, regardless of nationality, and she would remember why she had become a nurse in the first place. Not to serve as Hatba, nation, or an ideology, but to heal. And James embodied that principle more fully than anyone she had ever known. They were falling, both of them, toward something that could not be sustained and could not be stopped. Every day the war continued, brought them closer together, even as it guaranteed their eventual separation. It was beautiful and tragic and completely impossible, and neither of them could imagine any more choosing any other path. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in May of 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Greta was changing bandages in the recovery ward when Lieutenant Morrison came in, her face flushed with emotion, and announced it to the room. The American patients cheered weakly from their beds. The German prisoners fell silent, their faces registering a complex mixture of relief, grief, and uncertainty. Greta's hands froze mid-motion, a roll of gauze suspended in the air. Over. The word seemed impossible. For 6 years, war had been the only reality she knew. And now it was simply over, ended not with dramatic finality, but with a radio announcement and the sound of distant cheering. She found James standing outside the surgical tent, staring at nothing. His face was unreadable. When she approached, he turned to her and for a moment forgot caution, forgot the rules that kept them apart in public. "It's done," he said quietly. "We won." The "we" hung in the air between them, a pronoun that had once meant his side, his nation, but now felt more complicated. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, because victory for him meant something entirely different for her. It meant repatriation. It meant the end of everything they had built in the protected bubble of wartime necessity. The camp transformed over the following weeks. The tension that had always existed, the underlying current of captor and captive, began to dissolve. Guards relaxed, prisoners moved more freely. There was talk of going home, though home was a complicated concept for most of them. The Nazi regime had collapsed utterly, leaving Germany and Austria divided among the victorious powers. Soviet forces occupied the East, British and American forces controlled the West. The country Greta had left no longer existed in any recognizable form. Letters began to arrive, filtered through Red Cross channels, bringing news that was rarely good. Cities destroyed, families displaced, lives shattered beyond recognition. Greta received word in June that her mother had survived, living in the British occupation zone of Austria with relatives. Her father had died in 1944 of pneumonia, made fatal by malnutrition and lack of medicine. She read the letter 3 times sitting on her bunk, feeling nothing at first and then everything at once. Grief for her father, whom she would never see again. Relief that her mother lived. And underneath both, a guilt so profound it threatened to crush her. She had been in a prisoner of war camp, eating regularly, sleeping in a bed, doing meaningful work, while her father had died from want of the most basic care. The inequity felt obscene. James found her that evening. He didn't ask what was wrong. Her face told him everything. They were alone in the supply tent, checking inventory before night shift. He violated every regulation, every protocol, and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed against him and wept, for her father, for her shattered homeland, for the impossible situation they now faced. He held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could make any of it better. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked up at him. "I have to go back," she said. "My mother, she needs me. Austria needs nurses. Everything is destroyed." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." 2 words, infinite pain behind them. They stood in silence, still holding each other, both knowing this moment had been inevitable since the day they fell in love. The war's end had always meant their end as well. The mathematics were simple and cruel. She was Austrian. Her duty was to her people, to rebuilding what had been broken. He was American. His duty was to the army, to whatever orders came next. There was no equation that resulted in them together. But James Bennett had not become a surgeon by accepting impossible diagnoses without fighting. Over the next week, he began to research quietly and carefully, using his limited authority and calling in favors from fellow officers. He discovered that the path forward, while difficult, was not entirely impossible. The United States military had regulations for marriages between American personnel and foreign nationals, including former enemy nationals. There would be paperwork, extensive paperwork, investigations into her background to ensure she posed no security risk, affidavits and approvals and bureaucratic hurdles that could take months or years. But it could be done. It had been done. There were precedents. He presented this information to her one night in the hospital, spreading papers across a desk like a surgical plan. "This is how we could make it work," he said, his finger tracing through forms and regulations, "if you wanted to, if you were willing to stay." If you wanted to carried the weight of everything unspoken. He was asking her to choose him over her homeland, to abandon her mother and her duty for the possibility of a life together. It was an impossible ask, and he knew it. But he asked anyway because the alternative, letting her go without trying, was worse. Greta looked at the papers, at his earnest face, at the hope and fear mingled in his expression. "My mother," she began, and her voice cracked. "She is alone. Austria is in ruins. They need medical personnel desperately. How can I stay here while my people suffer?" It wasn't a rejection. It was a plea for him to understand the weight of what he was asking. He did understand. He took her hands in his, those surgeon's hands that had taught her so much. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs. But Greta, you can't save Austria alone. You can send money to your mother. You can help from here. And maybe, selfishly, I need you too. I love you. I've loved you for months, and I know this is terrible timing and unfair and complicated, but I'm asking anyway. Stay. Marry me. Choose us." The proposal was everything and nothing like she had imagined. No ring, no flowers, just two exhausted people in a hospital tent surrounded by the detritus of war, choosing love despite every rational argument against it. She looked at him, this man who had held her when she wept, who had taught her that the enemy could be kind, who had shown her a different way of seeing the world. Then she looked down at the forms on the desk, legal documents that could transform her from prisoner to immigrant, from enemy to wife. The decision should have been impossible. Instead, it felt inevitable. "Yes," she whispered, then louder in English that had become fluent through necessity and love. "Yes, James, I will marry you." His face transformed, relief and joy flooding features that had been tight with tension. He pulled her close again, and this time when he kissed her, it wasn't forbidden or stolen. It was a promise. The bureaucratic process proved every bit as difficult as James had warned. Greta had to be transferred from prisoner of war status to a special category for foreign nationals seeking to immigrate through marriage. She underwent interviews with military intelligence officers who questioned her extensively about her background, her political beliefs, her activities during the war. They asked if she had been a Nazi party member. She hadn't been. Austrian nurses were not required to join, and she had avoided it deliberately. They asked about her work in the field hospitals. She answered honestly, describing the medical care she had provided, the men she had tried to save regardless of their nationality or allegiance. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, she existed in a strange limbo, no longer quite a prisoner, but not yet free. James navigated the military bureaucracy with the same focused determination he brought to surgery. He filed forms, made calls, leveraged every connection he had. Lieutenant Morrison, once concerned about their relationship, became an unexpected ally, writing a letter of recommendation that praised Greta's medical skills and character. Other members of the hospital staff did the same. Even some of the recovered American soldiers she had treated wrote letters supporting her immigration. In October of 1945, the approval finally came through. Greta Hoffman was cleared to remain in the United States as the fiancée of Captain James Bennett, pending their marriage. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the base chapel. It was nothing like the grand Austrian weddings of her youth, no ornate church filled with hundreds of guests, no elaborate reception, just a handful of medical staff, a military chaplain, and 2 people who had found each other across enemy lines and refused to let war dictate their future. Greta wore a simple dress that Lieutenant Morrison had helped her buy in the nearest town. James wore his dress uniform. When the chaplain asked if anyone objected to the union, there was only supportive silence. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering applauded. Helena, the older Austrian nurse who had warned Greta months ago to be careful, was there, tears streaming down her face. "You chose love," she whispered to Greta afterward. "In a world full of hate, you chose love. That takes more courage than anything." The transition from prisoner to immigrant to American wife happened in stages, each with its own challenges. Greta had to learn to navigate a country she had only seen through the narrow lens of a prison camp. James received orders to return stateside, to a hospital in Virginia. They traveled together across an ocean she had crossed once in chains and now crossed free. America, the real America beyond military camps, was overwhelming. The abundance she had witnessed in the camp was multiplied 1,000-fold in the civilian world. Stores with shelves full of goods, restaurants serving portions that would feed 3 people, cars everywhere, more cars than she had seen in her entire life in Austria. She wrote to her mother regularly, long letters describing her new life and enclosing money when she could. Her mother's responses were bittersweet, proud that her daughter had survived and found happiness, but lonely in a devastated homeland that needed years to rebuild. Greta carried that guilt with her always, a weight that never fully lifted. She had chosen her own happiness over her duty to her people. Some days that choice felt like freedom, other days it felt like betrayal. But as months became years, as she built a life with James and eventually started working as a nurse in American hospitals, she began to understand something crucial. Her experience, her transformation from enemy prisoner to American citizen, was part of a larger story. She was one of thousands of former prisoners of war who had come to see America not as the propaganda monster they'd been taught to fear, but as a nation of ordinary people capable of extraordinary decency. Some, like her, had stayed. Most had returned to Europe, but all of them carried back a truth that propaganda could never erase, that compassion could exist even between enemies, that healing transcended politics, that humanity was stronger than ideology. The medical knowledge she had gained working alongside James and the American medical staff, the techniques with penicillin and sulfa drugs, the protocols for blood transfusions and trauma surgery, all of it was knowledge that thousands of former prisoner medical personnel took back to Europe. They became the doctors and nurses who rebuilt their nation's healthcare systems. They trained a new generation of medical professionals. In this way, even those who returned contributed to reconciliation and rebuilding. Medicine, it turned out, was a language of peace more powerful than any treaty. Greta and James built a life that was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. He became chief of surgery at a regional hospital. She worked in the pediatric ward, finding special meaning in caring for children who would never know the war that had shaped her. They had 2 daughters who grew up hearing stories about how their parents met in a hospital tent in North Africa, how love had bloomed in the most unlikely place. The girls heard these stories as romantic adventure. Only later did they understand the courage it had taken, the sacrifices made, the bridges crossed. In 1978, when Greta was 61 years old, she and James returned to Austria for the first time since the war. Her mother had passed away 5 years earlier, but Greta wanted to see Salzburg again, to walk the streets of her childhood, to reconcile the place in her memory with the reality. The city had been rebuilt, though scars remained. The fortress still stood, eternal and watchful. The church bells still rang. But it was no longer her home. Home was the house in Virginia, the hospital where she worked, the life she had built with James. Austria was her past. America was her present and future. Standing in the Mirabelle Gardens, looking up at the fortress, James took her hand. The same hand he had held that first day in the prison camp hospital, checking her pulse, showing her unexpected kindness when she expected only cruelty. 33 years had passed since that moment. His hair was fully gray now, her own streaked with silver, but his touch was still warm, still gentle, still the thing that had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying? Choosing me over everything else?" She thought about the question carefully, as she always did. The honest answer was complicated. She regretted not being there when her father died. She regretted the years her mother spent alone, She regretted missing the chance to help rebuild her homeland in its darkest hour. These regrets lived in her heart and always would. But she had also built something beautiful from the ruins of war. She had saved lives, raised children, loved deeply, and proved that reconciliation was possible even when it seemed impossible. "I regret what I lost," she said finally, "but I cannot regret what I gained. You, our life, our children, the chance to prove that love is stronger than war. No, James, I do not regret choosing you." He squeezed her hand, that surgeon's hand that had held thousands of lives and now held hers. "Thank you," he said simply, "for having the courage to say yes." The arithmetic of love, Greta had learned, could not be calculated through logic or nationality or circumstance. It could only be measured by the willingness to see humanity in the other, to extend compassion when hate would be easier, to choose connection over division. She had arrived at that prison camp in 1943 expecting monsters and found healers instead. She had been taught that Americans were her enemy and discovered they were simply people, as complicated and flawed and capable of goodness as anyone. That discovery had changed everything. In the end, the greatest victory was not military but human. The war had tried to make enemies of everyone, to reduce people to flags and uniforms and ideologies. But in hospital tents and surgical wards, over coffee cups and shared exhaustion, through small acts of kindness and the universal language of healing, connections were made that propaganda could not break. Greta's story was one among thousands, but each story mattered. Each choice to see the human rather than the enemy, each decision to extend mercy rather than vengeance, each moment of love blooming in war's ruins. These were the victories that truly mattered. The doctor had held her hand that first day, a simple gesture of medical care. But in that touch, in that unexpected gentleness, he had given her something more valuable than medicine. He had given her a reason to believe that the world could be different than the one she had known, that enemies could become lovers, that prisoners could become citizens, that an Austrian nurse and an American surgeon could build a life together despite everything that said they shouldn't. The hand that had checked her pulse had ultimately held her heart, and in that holding, both of them had found not just love, but proof that even in war's darkest hours, humanity endures.